Okie dokie. So this is the second meeting of the survey working group to work on the manuscript following the results of the survey. So thanks to everybody who's made comments on the manuscript. Does everybody have access to that?
Yep.
I think Amanda's already commented, and I know Matt and Onyeka have commented as well, as has Fiona. So that's really helpful. Because I've been unwell, I've not had as much chance to look at it as I wanted to, but I will make sure we kind of mop up some of these comments as best we can.
Do you have the link there shared today? I might have been out of the meeting as you shared it.
I haven't, but let me just pop that in the chat now.
I apologise if I was meant to do something between last time and now. The call we had.
Don't worry. I think we're all in the same boat. So I think it's just helpful. Fiona's coming. Just let Fiona join. Oh, I'm not quite sure what's happened to Fiona. So here she is.
Okay.
Hi, Fiona.
Hello. Sorry about that I'm late. At a previous meeting run late.
No problem. We are just making a start, and just to let you know, the meeting's being recorded. So hopefully that's okay.
Sure.
So people have been making comments on the draft manuscript. So we've got the beginnings of an introduction. So it would be helpful for people to have a look at that and suggest any changes if they felt they were required. And we've also got the beginnings of a methods section. So again, I think we're just at the stage of asking for comments or suggestions on how to improve that. We've looked at the ability to include supplementary information for the journal, which is currently planned for Documenta Ophthalmologica, and they do allow supplementary information to be included. So it's been suggested that we include both the survey questions and the organisations contacted as supplementary information. The main thing outstanding that probably needs work is the results section. So I guess before we start talking about the results, is everybody happy that with the introduction and methods plan that just kind of comments are made on that, or does anybody particularly want to discuss the introduction or the methods? No? Okay. So if we talk about the results section then. I didn't have time to re-watch the recording, and I know we spent quite a bit of time discussing how to break up the results or group things together. So I just wanted to be clear on what we'd decided for grouping the results. We talked about combining some of the subcategories together. So I just wanted to be clear on what the final decision was, because we've got in the draft table, we've got a couple of different categories where people could only respond to one of these, and they either performed clinical eye tracking and either did or didn't interpret the results. So I thought we were going to combine those together. Then we had a small subgroup that were do not perform tracking but interpret the results of others. So I was just a little bit unclear on where we were going to combine that group with. And then we had a professional body group and a manufacturer group that I think we talked about bringing those together because they were responding on behalf of others. So Matt's nodding to that. Do you remember this, Matt?
Yeah. Gemma, the recording of the last meeting's not on the website yet. Did you send
No,
that
I have just sent it to C1,
okay.
So that's my delay, but that is on its way. Okay. So I can just re-watch that to remember where we got to, but I just was, I guess, trying to have it clear in my mind how we're thinking is best to group these, because we have this other group which are quite difficult to disentangle and join them with others, because they so do people have a recollection of that grouping, or do they have a strong preference for how we should be combining these?
We did
I
decide.
remember a discussion where we were talking about if people interpret the eye movements, that is, like, for our purposes, a core kind of category. If they're just recording but they don't ever look at them, it seems like that would be a separate category.
Okay. So we've got, go for it, Rasha.
I think the grouping is important in a way that maybe people would like to know what clinicians have said, and what, for example, what manufacturers have mentioned in those specific questions that are, especially in the questions that are actually common between both, and then there are specifics for each one then also, which will be mentioned, that this was only asked to clinicians, for example. I think so. It will give a more in-depth overview, I think. But we can always, like, get back to it as we start writing. But of course, I know we need to plan. We need to plan before digging.
Yeah, I guess it's relevant for kind of how the results section's going to look, and how we're kind of grouping these different categories.
Can we just group them as because my concern with perform clinical eye tracking but do not interpret the results is there's two. So could we group them sort of in with the others, and then have perform clinical eye tracking, interpret the results but don't do the actual tracking themselves, and then professional bodies and manufacturers as sort of the main categories of this? Because the others, I feel like, are sort of almost outlier type / we don't have enough data in those other categories.
So you're suggesting that we have a professional body,
sort of 4 sections,
or manufacturer, and then keeping the others as others.
Yep. And
then
maybe putting the perform the clinical eye tracking but do not interpret the results in with them.
Perform but do not interpret to be with
the others.
I remember last time we were discussing that part of the restrictions will come from how the survey was actually structured, because there were different groups of questions for the different I think what you're suggesting, that would work fine there, because I think you're not suggesting anything that would mix any of those groups that were otherwise split in the original layout, I think. But we did discuss all this last time.
We did. I just wanted to be clear on where we were going with the groupings, because then it affects that presentation of the results.
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't at the last one. So I'm not sure
no, don't worry. It was
sorry.
No, don't apologise. It was, I can rewatch the recording just to kind of catch up on that last bit. Okay. So I will just rewatch the recording to kind of double check what we kind of agreed last time. It's just those, I mean, to me, the perform the tracking but don't interpret, and don't do the tracking but interpret, it's those two that we just need to be happy with where they're going. What do people feel about combining professional body and manufacturer together?
Should we just go with, if you go with whatever we decided last time, because we spent a long time discussing it, and then let's just assume that we make a good decision on that point now, based on what we discussed last time.
And then we can circulate the question maybe on either on the Google Doc or in an email if it's
Yeah,
still open.
if it opens any
Yeah.
further questions.
Yeah. I
Okay,
agree.
fine. I shall do that. Let's. So the next part to so what's emerging from people's drafts is they're kind of suggesting writings of different kind of chunks of it. So Onyeka's kind of had a little go at kind of combining some of this to just avoid having like multiple tables spitting out numbers. So I think comments on the suggestions, comments on the suggested text are helpful. And
what do we want in terms of the table? So I'm quite happy to have a go at the figures and tables. They're sort of saying showing professional role, showing eye tracking devices. That was Onyeka's comment.
yeah, so it's whether we have I think this involved with a professional body needs some more numbers to it because we did have a couple of responses from the same professional body. And then the eye tracking devices used. I guess that's slightly different to what's in this first table. I mean, it's essentially just quite a long list of different eye trackers and how much, but I do think that's helpful because I think it gives people context of what devices they've got experience with and therefore how they're answering. So I think that would be good. What do other people think? I think that's helpful.
Do we want that overall of just what's being used, or do we want to try and differentiate that based on the different professions? Like if there's a particular preference that's emerging in one over the other?
Yeah, so the professions wasn't stated in every case.
Yeah.
There will be differences, like ENT professionals are more likely to use so-called VNG systems that are kind of
That's
more
what I'm
tied to
thinking.
caloric irrigation and so on. So I think listing all the devices used and then maybe doing some kind of breakdown, just to say as appropriate. But I'm aware this is one of the things that I'm currently doing, kind of tour of eye movement facilities in the UK. I'm finding that there's a bit of a disconnect between those of us that do eye movements per se and those of us who are doing ENT stuff, who've been using eye tracking for ages, absolutely ages, and it's kind of well embedded. But they don't. And I think we probably haven't reached, although we've tried to reach a lot of these people. I'm not sure we've got many responses. Do we know how many ENT people we have, Gemma?
We've got quite a few neurologists, neuro-ophthalmology, otto-neurology.
Okay, that's the.
And then we've got definitely one that specified ENT. We've got more neurologists than we've got. We've got about 3 audiologists.
Okay. So we've got some who are involved in ears and.
But yeah, I take your point there, Amanda. It might be that if we can present that by, let me add a comment to that effect.
Because that'll let us, in the discussion, talk about the sort of ranges of conditions that are seen by these and where some of those guidelines might come from, particularly if we're talking things like ENT where it's well embedded. They may be an easy sort of next step to take as well, but just kind of recognising that that'll have that broader reach.
Also, I think that's probably for ISCET as well. If we do think there's a gap in who we're reaching and who we're talking to, it's making us aware that there's a potential gap.
I assume Matt is spruiking the good word.
Sorry?
I assume you're spruiking the good word of ISCET on your travels.
Oh yeah, I mean, actually, I'm kind of visiting a lot of people that are already involved. Yesterday, I was with Denise, who's in this committee as well in Bristol Eye Hospital. At some point, I'm going to visit Gemma, but yeah, I'm just kind of So most people are already involved to some extent. I have managed to reach out to a few ENT people in London, so I'm hoping to go and see them and show them, talk to them about what we're doing. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, ISCET got quite a mention at a recent paediatric ophthalmology and strabismus conference in the UK, actually, because Ruth was talking. So she was talking about ISCET and ISEV, and so it is getting mentioned. But obviously, I don't really have much of I don't go to ENT conferences, and I don't have as many links with them.
It's strange how disconnected the two seem to be. I
Yes.
guess it's just that they both use eye trackers, and they're not really using eye trackers to look at the eye movements per se. They're using the eye movements as a proxy for checking vestibular function, right, which is related.
Yeah, I mean, I've only once been to our ENT department in Sheffield to look at what they're doing, and they're essentially just trying to differentiate like vestibular from ocular, like nystagmus.
Yeah, I'll do what I can. Sorry, Fiona.
I think a couple of people from, so the group that the hospital that we work with and have a department with, and where I recorded was in the ENT department where they're doing vestibular VHIT tests and things like that. And I think a couple of them did respond to the questionnaire.
Good.
Well done, Fiona.
I mean, I can't, there's no way to confirm, right? So, but I think so. I did spread it around the ENTs we work with in the group.
Okay.
And they are using really, there's like one system dominant in that market. So it seems like there's not a huge amount of variance in the eye trackers being used for vestibular function tests, because they have to withstand these very abrupt head movements, and that means they need like a special mount that's not going to move on the head and so on. So they do seem to be quite restricted. We only had 2 systems mentioned, and the intraacoustics one seems to be the most ubiquitous for those purposes. There is another system produced actually by the same manufacturer who makes the intraacoustic system, but it's not approved for clinical use because it's binocular. So it's a different system that's owned by the company who originally designed that system, but it's not got a clinical approval. So I think that's might be one of the restrictions for ENT, that they haven't been approved for clinical use, a lot of the systems.
So Fiona, are you saying the typical intraacoustic system only measures from one eye at a time?
That's correct. In the hospital I've worked in Copenhagen, yes.
Okay, that's seriously limiting for nystagmus assessment and so on.
Right, and I think that they may have another tracker. It may be possible that you could have binocular, but it's not designed to withhold the VHIT, you know, the head movement performed by the clinician, where an ordinary eye tracker would move quite a lot and therefore invalidate the measures, because you're looking for mainly changes in the saccadic profile, or, you know, interruptions that are nystagmus or interruptions to smooth pursuit and so on.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of the audiologist responses, things like Vesticam, Otometrics, video head impulse, interacoustics, VNG, infrared goggles, and then a few IC cam, Otometrics. So some of them have kind of listed.
So the IC cam is either their own system, which is not clinically approved, or the intracaustic system, which uses IC-CAM.
Okay. I mean, these aren't systems that I'm familiar with.
So I'd suggest then if we're going to report the different tech that people are using, if there's some way of grouping together those people who said their profession was something to do with the ears versus everyone else, maybe. That might be a useful distinction to make in the grouping.
Or it could be, just as a suggestion, you could also group them by the kind of tests they're used for, because I think that is a very real category, just in terms of the vestibular tests needing specific hardware. So, because very often a neurologist might do a VHIT test to check vestibular function to rule out central causes of balance issues, for example. So they might not be in an ENT department, but they're still doing vestibular tests even in emergency clinics. It could be possible to do that to rule out any central issue with balance.
So maybe we need to have a look at the systems that have been put up and have a look at what they're capable of.
Yeah, because the other way round of doing it is, rather than do it by profession, is do it by device and list the professions that are using that device.
Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe tests that are performed. I'm just thinking out loud, so I don't have a strong list, but maybe tests that are performed would be a nice logical way to group the systems, and the professions would kind of come from that, because
sorry, Fiona, you continue. Sorry,
the different systems do really limit what tests you can run with them.
The only difficulty with that is we didn't specifically ask, what do you
tests
do?
are you doing?
Yeah, so we would be having to then go and find information about what that tracker can do, and that might not capture things that they're doing that are not that.
Right.
Yeah.
I was just going to add just a bit of background with this tour that I'm doing. I've been to 3 different eye hospitals so far, and they all do things completely different. And in one case, they're not necessarily using the eye tracking protocols built in, but rather they will just have the eye tracker running, and then could do all kinds of tests. You know, it could be head movements, it could be covering the eyes, it could be getting to look different gaze positions, and they'll just use that live, almost like a microscope on the eye movements. And so, just because a system has or does not have a particular test built in doesn't mean that it's not being done.
Yeah.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And because we didn't ask them, what are you doing with it? I feel like there would be an assumption there that just because it can measure these things, because some of the lists of what it can do are pretty extensive as well, but it doesn't mean that's what they're using it for. We just asked, what device are you using?
Yeah, I there's a lot of ways to do it. I mean, if you had the list of eye trackers that come up, I'd be happy to go and find their manufacturer webpage if they have one, and take some kind of structured information on what tests they're advertised for, or what kind of usage if that's useful.
The problem, I think, with doing that is something like the SR research tracker, for example, is you don't have set protocols or anything else. It's what's been programmed. So we're not going to know what they're using it for beyond what sort of a system it is, if that makes sense. So whether or not we group them when we go, these are video-based trackers, these are ear-based, like, I don't know. I'm thinking out loud there. Yeah, Matt, sorry.
Oh, yeah, so I was just going to suggest that... oh, sorry, Rush is in front. Go ahead, Russia.
Well, I was going to say, as we didn't ask specifically what each one uses the test, the eye tracker for. So then mentioning the subspecialty or the specialty then would be important in that sense, because the tracker alone, like, well, let's assume that if we say that people use it in ophthalmology, then we will, as ophthalmologist, we will, anticipate like uses or in ENT and things like that. So I think it's in that sense, it's important to mention who said what. Grouping, I mean. And then maybe we would also, if possible, have also a collection on the devices, maybe in the supplementary part, like a table or something. So then we would cover both, but I believe the focus also on specialities would be important.
I'm kind of thinking this should be sorry, Matt, go.
Sorry, I was just going to say that I think there are so many eye trackers available now that it might be that trying to group them by the eye tracker and then looking at the specialities might provide very low numbers, and so it might be better to go the other way and look at the specialities and then what type of eye tracker they use. And the second thing I was going to mention is that if we have got lots of different eye trackers, you can at least group them by whether they're head mounted, which is more likely to be the VNG people, the ENT, versus desk mounted or maybe even in-rest type systems, but maybe those go together.
Yeah, I mean, in previous standardization work, we always made that distinction between head-mounted, tower-based systems or remote systems, just because each of them implies different restrictions, and that is going to affect, you know, the tests. Like the SR research system typically doesn't allow much head movement. There is a remote setting, but you couldn't do a V-hit with that. You know, whereas the head-mounted are the ones where basically all vestibular tests need them to be head mounted, and not only standard head mounted, but special mounts that are particularly secure tend to have these elastic kind of swimming goggles kind of mount. But that would certainly fit with previous standardization categories that you would, you know, separate head mounted and remote systems, and also EOG systems.
I mean, because I'm not familiar with all of these eye trackers that have been included, I wouldn't immediately know like which are head mounted. So I think that's probably going to be useful to add. So rather than Fiona like checking what each website says they can do, I think it would just be more helpful for us to have in that table, or however we present it, that some categorization to explain to people who aren't familiar with them,
right,
including me, what they are. I guess the tricky thing is, I mean, for like the iLink, so the iLink's quite a common one, the iLink 1000 plus, and that can be tower mounted or remote mounted. But I guess if there was some kind of key that just kind of said what each of these are, then you could have both, couldn't you, for that? So I think that would be helpful to the reader rather than just a list of devices. It could be the device with a key saying head mount, tower mount.
And maybe we color code that key or something.
Yeah. Okay.
And I mean, some specs like the scales or. Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm going to the websites, then it makes sense to, you know, collect whatever might be useful all at the once, and could include some kind of suggested categorization along head mounted versus remote and so on. But you could also include perhaps, you know, the sample rate, or, you know, whether it's monocular or binocular and things like that as well. Head box size, you know, that can also often be reported and gives you an idea of whether the head is free to move or fixed.
Yeah, I agree. I think those are all really good things to list, and I guess we don't need to have a single, you know, table showing what the eye tracker was and how to break that down. It can be broken down with multiple pie charts or whatever we choose to do. What was I going to say? I can't remember now. I think it was to do with just the way that they break down, and we're expecting to see. Oh, that was it. To do with peripheral eye tracking. Obviously, many of the tower systems, the remote systems, you only get that kind of, you know, central tracking can be done with that. You can't get the extreme eye movements that would allow you to diagnose gaze paretic nystagmus, for example. So I think we'll probably find a natural break in that. And I had something I needed to say, but I've forgotten, so I'll just pass.
That's okay, Matt, don't worry. The only thing I was going to add as well is it might be difficult to, I appreciate you can go to SR Research's website and look up the spec, but we don't know that they've got that exact spec. They might have an older version of a tracker. So some people have written iLink 1000. Well, ours is an iLink 1000 plus. So do we assume they've got an older version, or they've just not typed it right, or, you know, and actually things have changed over time. So we didn't ask them to specify the date or the spec. Go for it, Matt.
Yeah, the other thing, what I remember now I was going to ask was, did we have a question about calibration, about how they calibrate? Because there are issues, for example, patients with gaze paresis, it's very difficult, if impossible, to calibrate, you know, unless you can typically calibrate on another person which provide you a very vague sense of where they're looking.
I don't remember this question.
that
I
was-
don't think so.
Always in retrospect.
We talked about people with central vision loss or total vision loss. I seem to remember the last day that, you know, that calibration, if they don't have central vision loss, some of the clinicians who were present were bringing that up, that it's impossible to calibrate. But the point was that for many of the measures that would be relevant, it doesn't matter actually that much. And I was making the small point, I think a small chat started on the side of the meeting, that where you have, for example, nystagmus happening with very oblique eye direction, so eye in head direction, that typically the accuracy, especially if it's a remote tracker, is much worse when the person isn't looking straight ahead, if they're looking off to the side, just because you get an oval shaped pupil at that angle and so on. And you might have a better chance of eyelashes and things getting in the way of the pupil image.
Yeah.
So I don't remember if we talked about anything other than vision loss being an issue for calibration, other than to say that it shouldn't affect most of the tests that would be run, especially if they're vestibular or, you know, movement-based measures.
So there's probably a little bit of a crossover with the two meetings here, because I think some of these discussions.
Oh, you're right, actually.
No,
you're right.
Yeah.
Sorry.
For this survey, we didn't ask about calibration. But I appreciate that would be helpful to know. I think we were just kind of asking who does what, but we weren't drilling down. I think we had a discussion, didn't we, about do we want to know exactly what everybody's doing, and I think we just decided that was kind of probably a step too far.
I'll add that as in the discussion as a comment now, as a thing to maybe just mention as, you know, it would be useful to know in a future survey kind of thing. You know?
Yes. I mean, I think the main... Sorry, Fiona, you go.
Would it be helpful to include whether or not calibration is required to record when surveying the trackers that were mentioned? Because some systems won't allow you to record without calibrating, and that's when Matt's trick of getting someone else to stand in and using their calibration might come in.
Some, I think nowadays though, I mean, I've not seen one in person, but some claim they don't require a calibration, and I think they base it on the geometry of the patient's face.
The Tobii eyeglasses, for example, do it as an automatic calibration, as does, I think, the new Pupil Labs.
Yeah, the Pupil Labs and the Tobii system, they use a machine-based method to calibrate, but they still require one calibration point.
Okay.
So right at the start, you look at one dot.
Okay.
The new Tobii 3s I don't think. They have two options when you go into the software. You can put up that double circle, or you have one that just says automatic. So it either asks you for the target or it puts it on an automatic option. So I think there are options where it's on just like straight, this is what it thinks. And I have no idea how, like the black box of it does Larry's head in when he looked at them. But yeah.
Which device is this?
Tobii 3s.
Tobii 3. Okay, I'm going to look that up, because that's. I think for clinical eye tracking in the future, that's going to be essential, because if you've got either gaze paresis or nystagmus, then calibration becomes a real headache. So.
As does the non-standard timing on some of those systems as well.
You mean the sample rate?
Yeah, that one.
Right. Yeah,
it jumps around a little bit.
Right, and that's a major issue. That's another separation of eye trackers, whether the sample rate is software or hardware driven. And software driven means that it can vary a lot depending on the processing load. And that's a major problem for all movement-based measures, because it's kind of overlooked that, of course, everyone understands that the spatial accuracy and precision is important, but actually for most clinical measures, the temporal accuracy and precision is just as important, and it's often not mentioned at all. And that could be a useful and very easy to take measure of a system too, like in terms of like looking ahead to guidelines. Certain measures like V-hit or peak saccade velocity or main sequence, they require pretty steady sampling. And if that precision isn't there, it's just as bad as poor spatial imprecision in terms of the results.
So because we didn't really ask about calibration and understanding of all of these issues, I think Matt's point about adding them as discussion points is probably really helpful, because I think one thing that's come out of this as well is a lot of people were unsure about whether their device was actually a certified, like medical device. So I think that's part of a broader discussion about understanding the system that you're using and the limitations of that. And I think Fiona's point about accuracy of the collection of all of that is kind of part of the understanding of what you're doing and what the limitations are.
I think that'll be really relevant though for ISCET in general, because it's not something that you learn easily, if that makes sense, in terms of thinking about all the elements of the system and what it, like, if I think about something like a visual fields machine or something, for example, I wouldn't know all of the tiny little limitations and the other pieces that come into it. Like, if you think about that from just getting into it, clinical aspect of it, I just want to run it and then tell me what it means. So I think we've got to be like, we're all very, like, we've all done research in this, or a lot of us have done research in this space. We kind of know a lot of those different bits and pieces because we've spent ages in the systems. But I think one of the points of ISCET was to try and get more people clinically involved. And so making that easy, if that makes sense, rather than having to understand all of the pieces.
And I think that's where the guidelines are going, with nystagmus and with, it might be that one guideline or one document that's put together is that introduction to doing it and understanding the practicalities and the limitations, because as you say, you want to, in an ideal world, move people to doing it, but then move them from just being a technician and being told to do it in a certain way to actually understanding it and interpreting it. Go, Matt.
I would just say that in my visits that I've been doing, I've seen very different approaches. So in one place, there was essentially the clinician is there doing the tests live, looking at it and deciding which test to do in which order. And they would argue that this cannot be done by a technician because it requires that direct input at the time and looking at the patient, how they carry themselves, or they've got head postures and so on. And the second place that I've been used a different approach. They said, we just run the entire eye movement battery on everyone, whether on, we do anti-saccades even if it's not needed. Yes, it takes more patient time, but then afterwards they can bring the patient in, they can do all that kind of observation of them, and they can then be assessed by the clinician as a second class. So the clinician's time is not taken up doing the eye movement tests. So it's just two very, very different approaches. And I personally, I think I lean towards actually the second, which is more a bit of redundancy, but then you've got a record of it done live. Anyway, this is just.
It also means you won't miss something if you take the second approach.
Yeah, so it takes the thought out of the actual collection of the data, but I think if you can get a complete data set, then that shouldn't matter. Because they can always do further tests with the clinician at the end. Anyway, just interesting how variable is. And another
I bet you're having an interesting.
It's really fascinating. And one of them doesn't, so one of these places doesn't use their eye tracker at all, but they do EOG because they happen to be doing VEPs on everyone anyway, right? They're more into the electrodiagnostics, and so they get an EOG recording, which has of course got eye tracking. Or they want somebody there suggested quite a smart way of doing this, which would be you could do EOG at the same time as maybe an eye link. And that would allow you to get high fidelity recordings of the central stuff if you wanted to get, nystagmus waveforms, see if it's accelerating and the size of it and so on, where they have slow saccades maybe. And then peripherally, where the eye link drops out, you get something at least from the EOG, which gives you the waveforms. So, sorry, not all relevant here, but it's just fascinating. And I'm happy to share.
I think this is part of the wider discussion, isn't it, on what ISCET will be developing to support. Okay, so I've added those as discussion points. So essentially, going back to the results bit, we're saying that showing eye tracking devices is going to be helpful. So either a figure or a table, and we're talking about doing that by specialty, but then including some kind of key or coding for each of those devices, providing information about whether they're head mounted, tower mounted, remote mount. That's not set in stone, that categorization, but I do think that would be helpful, particularly when we're talking about cross-discipline understanding of what people are doing. Okay.
Just on the different kind of possibilities for grouping, because they're pretty endless, I would think.
Excellent, Fiona. Just what I wanted to hear.
That's true.
No, but what I was thinking was there was actually a purpose. I wasn't just trying to throw confusion in. But there are endless possibilities. But it seems to me that the questions that we ask of the data imply that maybe different groupings would be needed to answer the different questions. And I wonder if it just would help structure, the groupings and so on better if we were to focus on the research questions we want to actually answer and group accordingly for each one.
So do you mean specific to that question?
Well, we might have a question. Sorry. So we might have a question, which kind of eye tracker do you use? And then we can look at grouping the answers according to head mounted versus remote or tower mounted, and also any other factors that we wanted. So like there might be some questions in there that kind of touch on eye data quality issues like sample rate or precision or so on. And then maybe a different grouping is needed. But it seems like for different questions, different kinds of groupings of all of these factors that have been answered might be required. And I think if we do it according to what makes sense for each question, then we don't need like one unilateral way to group the information. We do it to what's needed for each question. So to structure it around the questions rather.
Yeah, so our original questions or purpose was to characterise current clinical use of eye trackers internationally. So I feel like we're doing that, aren't we? We're trying to work out the way to best present the data to reflect what's being done.
Do you need to have region demographics?
So we didn't capture that, because then we were getting into the realms of potentially identifiable data, identifiable responses. So we actually haven't.
It's a pretty small group as well for that.
Yeah.
I think it would be fair to say a reasonable research question is to know what properties any eye tracker would have if it's being used in a particular setting, and that comes down to what we've already been talking about, right? Is it head mounted or not, and the sample rate, because if you're looking, for example, for slow saccades, that's from the last week or so, I've seen somebody being diagnosed with PSP, which requires a check for slow saccades in the vertical, for example. So you can only do that with a high sample rate. So knowing those various properties, because that does inform ISCET's, how ISCET can recommend different trackers for different purposes.
Are we going to have any issues with that though, depending on that exact question that we had before of they may have listed what they've got, but is that an older version? Is that sampling at 500 rather than 1,000 hertz, for example? Because I don't think we've asked specifically what sample rate was. I could be wrong. I haven't checked that recently, but I'm like. Yeah.
As well, like if you're doing binocular recordings on an iLink 1000 plus, you're getting a different sample rate to monocular, aren't you? So
yeah,
I just don't feel like we're going to have the detail
granularity
to report that here, but yeah, it will come more with the condition specific, because if we move from nystagmus and we talk about either PSP or saccades, I think those things will come up then. Fiona.
Yeah, I was just going to say as well that I think the eye tracker you use is also going to be related to the people you're testing. Like for children example, you're not going to put pediatric patients usually on a chin rest or try and constrain the head, or for elderly people you know, where it might be difficult to keep the head in a chin rest for a period of time. I think that's also a question. There's a lot of reasons why people would choose one eye tracker over another, where they might not be able to choose the best quality for their purposes. And maybe that would be another question. Like if you were to have one question about, you know, where sample rate or whatever might be relevant to the answer, you could have another one which is looking at the populations that you're testing and see if there's, you know, a different grouping apparent in the data for along those lines, rather than try and have one single grouping for everything.
We also can't assume that just because people have any given eye tracker, it's actually the appropriate eye tracker for them. I think this is one of the things that ISCET's going to help with, is guiding people towards the appropriate tech.
Right.
Okie dokie. It feels like that kind of is coming along. So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Amanda, but did you kind of volunteer to try and collate some of that data?
I'm happy to collate some of that data and put some of that in sort of a rough go at a first table or figure or whatever we sort of think would fit with that. I'm happy to split them, I think. So maybe as a first pass, I'll do them by what was identified as a profession, eye trackers used, and just color code them into remote versus head mounted versus etc. And then see what that looks like unless we sort of come up with other pieces as that goes along. But I don't think we've got the granularity beyond that to do anything deeper in that space.
Okay. Everybody happy with that? Okay. I've been jotting down some notes, Amanda.
Keeping me honest, yeah, it's good.
Given that the methods is more or less done, I'm happy to be switched to a different section, or maybe just, you know, take an overview.
I think the next section that needs some work is the discussion, really. I think we're kind of coming up with discussion points. Fiona, sorry, did you want to come in there?
Sorry, yeah, just to briefly say that I actually made a copy of the document to work on the introduction, and I had like some skeleton text there that isn't quite ready, but it was more about like you know, more a lit review, kind of brief lit review on previous work that looked at guidelines and things like that. So I don't know if you want that to be included in the introduction, or if you rather, because what's in there now is just an introduction to the group rather than the topic. So I just would like some feedback on whether you envisage that as really needed.
I mean, my feeling on that is that it would strengthen the introduction, really, and give an introduction to, because as you say, what's there currently is more of an introduction to who we are and what we've done, but preceding that is kind of the background. So yeah, I would absolutely welcome that, because I feel like that's then not just about what we've done, it's about historically what others have done. And
it's just
I say yes.
Okay, so it's just a bit of contextualization, and the way I've approached it is, first of all, to have like bullet point what content should be in different paragraphs, and to attach citations to each bullet point. And I didn't go much further into full text yet, because I thought it was best to bring it to the group and get some feedback. And then it's actually pretty straightforward to sort of fill in those paragraphs with those citations.
Yep.
Include
include
others that the group might suggest as well. Because the reason I bring it up now is you're talking about the discussion, and typically the discussion is going to refer back to the studies you've introduced in the introduction and sort of refer these findings to the previous ones and so on. So I think if the intro is structured from the general to the specific like that, then the discussion could go specific to general back out.
I agree. It is difficult to write a discussion without seeing the results of the introductions.
Yeah, exactly. Just for that symmetry, and bringing back the same citation, so we don't end up like citing a whole load of new stuff in the discussion, which is not generally kosher. But then I think what would be really beneficial would also be to have some structure on the research questions we want to address.
So those would go at the end of the introduction, presumably.
Yeah. And it would also help structure the results and other parts too, because then we can go through the results according to each question we've raised. And that's, I was looking through the various documentation to see could I find that, and I haven't. That's not to say it's not there, and I just haven't found that. But like a list of what questions do we want to answer from this, I think would really help structure overall the paper.
So at present, we just have the two kind of main stated purposes of the survey, which is to characterise the use and to explore whether there is a need or desire for guidelines to be developed. So it could be that that is the subheading, and we kind of separate it by that.
Right.
But if people feel there are additional questions to be asked, I'm happy for suggestions on what those appropriate subheadings would be. But those were our initial kind of stated
Headlines.
Yeah.
They're probably good groupings for sort of main and results anyway.
Yeah, well, they wouldn't be specific enough for like research questions, and I think that having perhaps under those, main titles, we could have more specific questions listed that we want to answer, at least in a first pass, and maybe the results will suggest others that are interesting to look at as we go. But I think to start with just agreed couple of more specific sort of questions that can be turned into hypotheses somehow in under those two headings would be really useful for the structure. And also in terms of what to include, because those questions also kind of dictate what previous research is relevant.
Yeah. Particularly if that background information includes kind of other guidelines and how they've been developed and in what conditions. Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, Fiona.
Yeah, or maybe even there's previous papers that raise questions that we could adopt here, and that could also be relevant. But without that, I have to admit, I felt a little bit lost at sea, because there's literally an endless amount you could put in on this topic. And just to narrow it down, also bearing in mind that it isn't a huge group that we have, it's not a large amount of data, so we are limited by that and by whatever power analysis we might need to do at any point.
Thanks, Fiona. Rasha, you've got your hand up also. Hi, Rasha.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Now, I just want to remind us all that one of the outcomes of the survey actually is what pushed the nystagmus group to start, because that was one of the outcomes, like which discipline or which group do we start with. So I think this also needs to be mentioned and needs to be clearly displayed in the results, because then we will also reference this in our, hopefully this gets published, first in the whatever. But I mean, they're linked. I mean, we're working in succession, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Rasha.
I think that this was part of that,
Oh,
but I also think it was that there was a lot of expertise in that area and a lot of passion for nystagmus that made it the first. I'm not necessarily sure it was 100% all the survey.
Even though that was the stated purpose, but yes, I think you're right.
I think
became a product of both. Sorry.
Yeah, but it was also in the survey. Most of the many people were from the optometry and ophthalmology specialty. So also that was one thing.
I think remember we were quite surprised by those results. We kind of assumed, we hopefully had distributed it widely enough.
Yes.
That we did get responses from everybody, but I'm sure there'll be some bias towards.
Of course.
Setting the society up. Which
I agree.
But nevertheless, we were, I think, generally surprised by the amount of nystagmus, notwithstanding that potential bias, which is why it went down that route. So I only had my hand up just to ask that. So when Fiona's updated the introduction and when Amanda's got the results in, if you could let me know, or maybe we'll just keep in touch by email or on the forum, and then I will. Sure. At that point, I'll know to go for the discussion, just to make sure that we don't, that I don't miss it.
Great. So that brings us to 11:30 actually. So thank you very much for everybody's contributions and various different timings around the world. Thanks, Amanda. It's
Thank you
nice
for
that you've
making
been-
this earlier. This is brilliant.
Oh, no, that's okay. We've been trying to kind of alter the days and the times so that we allow other people to contribute. So thank you very much for joining us. I will get the recording to Siwan, and then we will continue to work on the various different sections. But yeah, I think a prompt email to say that various different sections are ready just keeps everybody chivied along. So this meeting's ended up being kind of 4 weeks, but are people happy for me to try and find a 3 to 4 week follow-up to kind of keep the momentum going?
Yep. And so what are we aiming to have at that point? Where do we want this to be?
I mean, in an ideal world, it would be nice to have the introduction, methods and results kind of more pulled together and drafted.
So should we try and say it's almost like an early first draft? Like there's no gaps as such, but we'll then be maybe looking to move it into whatever format.
Yeah.
Just trying to be.
No, that's fine. Keep pushing us along. That's great.
Yeah, that's fine for me. Just on, I know that we're finished, but just very briefly, for my own kind of working on it, the nystagmus, is it possible that the reason nystagmus has come to the fore is also because out of all the different eye movements, which are pretty well defined in terms of what they are, nystagmus, there is no kind of standard method for identifying nystagmus, unlike fixation and smooth pursuit and so on?
There are, if you mean like algorithmic approaches, there are, I think there's 3 that I'm aware of that will do that, but they're not really used clinically.
And there's not really been literature to kind of compare and contrast the results of those algorithms? Or,
not that I'm aware of, no.
And also the eye tracking manufacturers don't tend to include them as standard measures in the output.
No.
So for everything else, like something like SOR research will suggest what smooth pursuit, saccade even, but just in terms of working on the introduction, that would be a point that if you might agree, I might make in the introduction that, you know, there's quite a different guidelines out there for different kinds of eye movements, and nystagmus maybe is one of the most ill-defined.
I think in terms of clinical assessment guidelines, there's very little that's out there already, and arguably actually because vestibular nystagmus is done by audiologists, it's one of the few that actually does have guidance, because there's a society, I think it's actually the British Society of Audiologists that have published guidelines on vestibular assessment. So so paradoxically, it may be the only one that does have guidance in that respect. But you're right that it's not as built in. It's not as baked into these eye tracking systems which normally can just detect pursuit and saccades and fixations.
Yeah, and I think that's also because the literature just isn't as evolved. For fixation, everyone agrees it's 100 milliseconds within a degree or so, depending. But there isn't a similar kind of agreement out there for nystagmus.
Yeah, but there's so many different types of nystagmus as well, so they'll all have. You can't really use a one size fits all for these, because of the. Yeah, it's tricky. I've been looking at it for a long time now, and I still don't have a clear answer.
Yeah, maybe that's a point worth making in the introduction, that there's big variance in terms of how well defined the different movements are in the literature.
I think the introduction, I think that would be a nice discussion, because that led to the second subcommittee. But in the intro, I think sticking to the main, I think there were 3 aims of the society. That one of them would include nystagmus, that having like the guidelines in general, and also the ability to be able to reproduce and compare. Of course, they are well written in the aims, but I mean, I think that would be more in the introduction if I see it. And then the discussion, yes, we should mention what you mentioned, Fiona, that, okay, we then see that the nystagmus would be the most thing that needs our actually concern, and that's why we are starting the subcommittee. I think that's my point.
Yeah, you can't talk about the results until you've presented results. So if nystagmus rose as being the most important thing to talk about at this point, then I completely agree. It belongs in the discussion.
Great. On that kind
Was
of
there
point,
a question? Sorry, was there a question on which measures people are taking?
No.
no.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. I'm going to pause it there, but thank you very much, everyone. Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you so
All
much.
right. See you soon. Bye-bye.
See you
Bye.
soon. Bye.